Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some apple harvest cards using the I Pick You collection from Hero Arts. We have the apple branch stamp and cut and the In the Orchard stamp and cut. Beautiful for harvest cards, for fall cards. Even the apple branch one I think would be great for summer cards as well. Then we have your golden stamp and cut, some great sentiments. I love the nice big bold sentiments. I don't use bold sentiments a lot, so these are great. And then we have the apple frame layering stencils. So the first thing I'm going to do is do a bunch of stamping and embossing. I'm using some distress watercolor cardstock here because I plan on watercoloring my images. With apples having kind of multiple colors to them, I wanted to be able to get a good version of that. So for me, watercoloring is the best and easiest way to do it. And I also really enjoy watercoloring. Anytime I'm using a clear stamp set, the first thing I do is use an eraser on the stamping surface just to remove any possible manufacturing residue. And then I use a brush to clean that off so that we don't have any eraser bits in there. I just do it with every set that I use, whether doesn't matter who it's from. I always do this, and it's a habit that I've gotten into, and I do the entire set. So I know if I've used any part of a stamp set, I know that I've done it to the whole set. I don't have to do it again. This only has to be done once. So the piece of watercolor cardstock here that I have is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm trying to fill it up as much as possible because I am going to be die cutting these pieces, so it doesn't have to look pretty. So I'm trying to get 2 different sentiments in the corners as well as that apple branch. And I'm actually going to do this one twice. I'm going to swap out one of the sentiments, but I'm going to stamp and emboss it twice because I want to do 2 different cards with this apple branch with a couple different types of apple colors, if you will. First thing I do on my watercolor cardstock is use my embossing powder tool just to make sure there's no fingerprints or oils left from touching the cardstock. Then I ink up my stamp with VersaMark ink and stamp it. And I usually do this a couple times just to make sure that I have a nice clear image, or as clear as possible. I always do this with my Misti so that I can make sure that I'm stamping in exactly the same spot. It makes it so easy to do this and to do it multiple times. Once I pull that out of my Misti, I'm using some gold superfine embossing powder. I'm going to emboss everything with gold embossing powder. I thought it would work really well with the fall colors and with the colors that I intend to do with the apples. I think black would be great as well, but I thought the gold would just be a nice touch, especially for the images and then the coordinating sentiments to go with them. Once I've tapped off the excess of the embossing powder, I use my heat tool to melt that powder, and it goes from a rough, granular, kind of dark look to shiny gold. So it's kind of magical to see it. This is one of those techniques that's really easy, and I do it often, but when you're doing it with a new stamper, it's almost like magic. It's fun to watch and see their expression as that embossing powder melts, and it just makes the images really pop. It also makes it easier when doing watercoloring because it adds that ridge between the different areas. So it's a lot easier to do different colors in different areas right beside each other and not have to wait for your paint to dry. I also really like the contrast of the finish from the watercolor, which is usually kind of a matte flat look, and the shine of the embossing, the shine and the raised edge of the embossing. I think it's a nice contrast with the watercolor. So for this In the Orchard stamp set or stamped image that I'm embossing here, you can see that actually when I stamped, I kind of missed an area right within that tree. Now, if I had intended to use that entire image as is, I would have redone it, but I intended to put one of my bold sentiments over there anyways, because it does cover a large area of the card front, and I wanted to add some of these extra little bits on the bottom. So I'm not going to redo that because I planned on covering that anyways. But like I said, if you want the entire piece to show, that's a part that I would restamp and re-emboss if it was all going to be shown. So I did the rest of my stamping off screen, and I'm doing all of the embossing. And once my embossing is done, I will die cut the pieces that have dies to them that I want die cut. So my sentiments, I'm going to be die cutting all of them. The extra little bits from the In the Orchard stamp and cut, I'm going to be die cutting them. My main image with the basket from the In the Orchard stamp set is not going to be die cut. The apple branch and those sentiments are all going to be die cut. I'm not showing all of that die cutting on screen because it gets a little repetitive. But what I do is I find the coordinating die to go with it, and I use a bit of Best Ever Craft tape to tape those dies in place. That way when I'm running them through my die cutting machine, they're not going to shift or move on me. I can make sure that they stay exactly where I want them to be, and I can die cut them that way. And I'll usually do a whole sheet of die cutting at the same time. The only time I don't do that is if I've put my images a little bit too close to each other and the dies overlap. You never want the die to overlap. That's the best way to ruin a die set. So make sure that when you're die cutting a sheet of images or sentiments, that there's no dies that are touching. You want to make sure that they have space between them to make sure you don't damage them in any possible way. So once I have all of those die cuts done, I'm ready to start my watercoloring. Now I'm going to be doing some watercoloring with distress refills. It's one of my favorite things to watercolor with because it is nice and transparent. You can get a lot of shades of the same color, and it's just a great way to use up a supply that I already have because I use them already for re-inking my distress pads. I'm also going to be doing some watercolor with interference pads just because I really love when you watercolor them, where that color is a bit heavy, you get that beautiful shimmer. So I'm starting off with some of these extra pieces here. I'm using some walnut stain and I'm going to watercolor the ladder. I have a piece of paper towel to my right. This way, if I want to change colors or if I have a little bit too much color on my brush, I can easily tap it onto that paper towel. Another thing I can do is if I happen to get too much water and I want to dry up that brush, tapping it on that paper towel will work as well, will help with that as well. The water is in the handle of this brush, so it's really nice and clean. I tend to be a bit of a klutz, so if I was the type to have an open thing of water for painting, I would likely spill it. And if I didn't spill it, I'd probably drink it, but I would really likely spill it. So by having that water right in the handle, it's nice and clean and I can't have any possible accidents that way. So I'm going to be watercoloring basically all of my images at once. So I just watercolored that ladder and now I'm watercoloring the basket. I also want that in the walnut stain. So because I already have that walnut stain color on my brush, I might as well do anything that I want to have that color on. So once I'm done the basket, I will do the branches from one of the apple branches. And I typically will start where I want the color to be the darkest and then move on to where I want the color to be the lightest. For that second apple branch one, I'm not going to be showing a lot of it on screen except for the apples where they're actually done differently from the previous one. It's going to be a lot of repetition if I were to show that. And I can only talk so much. So for repetition, it's not very exciting. So we'll show you kind of the beginning of it and then kind of cut out to the next part. For my In the Orchard piece, I want to do a little bit of the sky behind there. So I'm using some tumbled glass, kind of trying to paint in between the leaves. Some of them it's a little bit harder to see what is sky and what is leaves. So I'm just making an educated guess. I'm starting at the top and then working my way down because I want to go from the bottom and work my way up with some green to make it look like grass on the ground. And I want those two to blend together. I am working fairly quickly because I don't want to let some of the edges of the paint dry in between. So I am not taking a lot of time or a lot of care to do this because this is just the background. It's not the focus of the card. And again, I don't want the edges of that paint to dry because that's when you get weird marks in your watercolor. So I'm working as fast as possible, trying to make sure that all of those edges stay wet while I'm working in between the leaves. I'm also not paying attention to making sure that everything is equal darkness or lightness. So you'll see I have some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker, and that's totally fine. I like the look of it. To me, that looks a little bit more interesting. So I leave it like that. If you're worried about it all being the same darkness or lightness, you could use a larger brush and kind of go over the entire thing. Because a lot of the leaves are green, they're going to cover that blue, and I plan on doing my apples like a red color, so that blue is quite a bit lighter. It would affect it a tiny little bit, but I think it would cover it really, really well. If you're worried about making sure that everything is completely covered and all the same darkness, that is an option as well. The brush that I'm using is a detailed water brush, so it's got quite a nice fine tip to it. There is a wide one that you can get. You can get them in different thicknesses or widths. The wide one that I typically use is a Tim Holtz one, and it works well for just doing washes on the back. So if you wanted to do a whole wash over the whole thing, that would be a great one to do, because you would get a lot less streaks from a smaller, or from that bigger brush, than you would from a smaller brush. Now, after I've got the sky as much as I want it, I can go from the bottom to the top, working with that Mowed Lawn to get that grass. Now, I always start where I want my color to be darkest, because that's when I have the amount of color that I want on the tip of my brush. So that's where the darkest color is going to be. So you can see that when I went to do the grass, I flipped the piece over completely so that I could start where the darker is and then work my way towards myself for the lighter. So I'll regularly be moving and twisting things around so that when I'm doing it, my brush is pointing to where I want the color the darkest. So for this apple branch, I want my leaves to be in one of the interference pads. So I'm using the Magic Garden pad. This one is green when you're working on white or light cardstock, but it has a blue interference color. So anywhere the color is darker, when you tilt it into the light once it's dry, you're going to see that blue interference, and it's a really pretty look. And especially because it doesn't cover that entire leaf, it's only where the color is darkest. So you could do this with the interference re-inkers. I choose not to, only because I would have to shake them all to make sure that they're really well mixed, as well as the fact that not everyone has re-inkers for every pad. So I just typically like to do it this way to remind you that if you don't have a re-inker for a pad, you can still use it as long as it's dye-based or water-soluble. You can squish it onto, I'm working on a glass surface here. You could do it on a piece of acrylic, on just any non-porous surface, and use that as a palette. A piece of acetate would work as well. So I'll squeeze that or press that onto my surface here, and I use that as a paint palette. I start again where I want the color to be darkest and then work my way where the color is lighter. And then if I don't get as much dark color in those darker areas as I want, I will grab some more of that ink on my brush and I will just dot it on those leaves. And because those leaves are still wet, because it's a fairly small area, that ink will automatically start blending and bleeding into the rest of the leaves. I did the other olive, I'm going to keep saying this olive branch all the way. I did the other apple branch off screen. So now I'm doing the leaves on the In the Orchard image. Once again, doing the same technique, but because these leaves are really, really tiny, I will be working on different areas at a time. I start at the top and then work my way down. If there's a leaf that I'm not getting quite as much color as I want, I will pick up a little bit more ink and just dot it to where I want the leaf to be darker. For me, that is typically where the leaf joins the branch. I will typically do the end or the tip of the leaf, the edge of the leaf lighter, and where it meets the branch and where the spine is in the middle, I will do that darker. For my apples, I'm going to be doing a combination of Cherry Bomb and Golden Sun. So Cherry Bomb is a beautiful bright red color. It has a purpley interference to it, so anywhere the ink is darkest is going to have that purpley tone to it when you tilt it into the light. The Golden Sun is more of a reddy orange color. It looks fairly similar when you're painting with it, which kind of surprised me, but it has a gold shimmer to it. So anywhere that color is darkest is going to have more of a gold shimmer to it than the purple. So I'm doing a combination of the two because I like the look of having the purple shimmer in some areas and the gold shimmer in other areas. So just like the leaves, I'm going to be doing everything that I intend to do with these colors. So I'm also doing the little rubber boots. I'm doing the apples in the basket, as well as there's a separate apple image that I had stamped, embossed, and die cut. When I'm coloring them, I'm kind of just going back and forth between the two colors. I'm not really paying attention to which color is which. When you have apples in a tree, they're not always exactly the same shade anyways. So there's a lot of leeway here. You can have some apples that are lighter in color, some that are darker in color, some that have the purple interference, some that have the gold interference. So it just adds more interest, in my opinion, to that image. Now, like I said before, I tend to, especially if I'm doing multiple pieces at once, tend to just jump between them to do all of the different areas in the same color. But you absolutely can finish an entire image and then start your way or work on the next one if that is more, or if you're more comfortable with that. Once I was done the apples in the cherry bomb as well as the golden sun, I thought there should be a little bit of yellow in some areas. So I'm using Sweet Treat. This is a nice bright yellow, but it has a pink shimmer to it that's really, really pretty. So I'm also using that same Sweet Treat for one of my apple branch images. This one is going to be yellow apples, but I'm going to add a little bit of green to them just so that they have more than one color tone to them. So I start where I want the color to be the darkest, same as the leaves and the rest of the things that I painted. And I leave one area that's a little bit lighter. Then I go and put just a little bit of that Magic Garden pad or Magic Garden ink onto my surface and then pick it up with my brush and blend it in. And because I've done these apples really quickly, that is still wet, so it's going to blend nicely between the green and the yellow. I can always take a little bit of that color off my brush and just help blend it along. For my next apple branch, I want these apples to be red, but I want there to be an area that is yellow on them. So I start with that yellow and then I go in with that cherry bomb. And this is going to be a nice combination with the pink shimmer from that Sweet Treat from that yellow. And then the purple interference from that cherry bomb is going to be really, really pretty. So because I already have my yellow there, I'm just working that red around it and then taking as much color off of my brush as possible and just blending those two colors together to get a nice blend to them. It doesn't have to be bright yellow in that area, so I can go over it with some of the red, and I do typically try to make sure that not every apple is exactly the same. I think it looks a little bit more interesting if they're all just a little bit different. Another option here would be to put a little bit of the green in there, but I opted not to because I already had green in the last apple branch image and I didn't want a chance mixing the green and the red together and ending up with some brown areas on my apples. So just doing the yellow as well as the red, I thought that was a little bit of a safer choice. So once I have them blended as much as I want and I have as much of the dark areas of red as I want, I will set that aside to dry completely. You want to make sure that the paints or the inks are dry completely before doing any die cutting. I don't want to be moving or getting any of that ink onto my cutting plate or changing the surface of it while I'm doing my die cutting. So here's the difference between the two. I love it in both of those colors. I do think the red apples kind of just pop a little bit more off of the green leaves, but the yellow ones, they're just nice for a little bit of a difference. And you can see when they're dry, you can see the interference colors just a little bit more. So my first card that I'm going to create is with this in the orchard image. I'm cutting it down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to put a mat around it, and that is going to be 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. You can see that I went around and around while I was trimming my piece there. I started at one edge and I wanted to make sure to get the part of the image that I wanted in there. So as I was working my way around it, I realized that I needed to cut a little bit more off of an area that I cut off of already. So I just went back and did that. When I'm using interference inks, one of the things that I love to do is use them on the piece of cardstock that I'm using as my mat. So the piece of cardstock that I used was just Hammermill cardstock. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. I rubbed the edges of the cardstock with the interference color. That one I did with the golden sun. It makes a beautiful mat. It matches perfectly with the colors that you use to watercolor, and it also has that interference property to it. So when you tilt the card into the light, you still get that interference. So it ties in with those colored images. Now you could do the entire watercolor with interference inks, but I think it is a little bit more interesting to do some areas with just regular distress inks or dye-based ink, because it doesn't really have to be distress ink, anything that you like for watercoloring. I like the difference in the finish, so I only will use the interference inks for areas that I want to have that little bit of shimmer to them, that I want to draw a little bit more attention to. So once I have my card layered together, I added my sentiment, then my ladder, and then put the little pair of rubber boots on there, as well as the little cluster of apples by the basket. I have a bunch of sentiments here because I just did all of them. I didn't know when I was doing my stamping and embossing which ones I was going to be using. I had some of them planned which I wanted to pair them with, but some of them I didn't have certain uses for. So a lot of those extra ones I'll be putting on the insides of the cards. For my next card, I'm going to be using one of the apple branches, and I'm going to be using the one that has the yellow watercolored apples to it. I have 2 pieces of Hammermill cardstock here. One is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. That one's going to be my mat. The other one is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and that one is going to be for my image piece. For my mat, I took the Sweet Treat interference pad and I just rubbed that along the edges. And then for my background here, I'm going to take some of the Tumbled Glass Distress pad and I'm going to do a little bit of light ink blending just behind where that branch is going to be. Another option here would be to use some blue cardstock, but I really love the look of ink blending because you can get some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker, and it just has a little bit more visual interest in my opinion. So for this particular card, I'm only concentrating on behind the area that that branch die cut is going to be. So the rest of it, I'm just leaving it white. I'm going to do another variation of this for my next card, change it up just a little bit. But I like having that blue behind there because it really makes that apple branch pop off of the back of the card. I glue both my mat as well as that ink blended piece to my card base, and I'm just using white A2 card bases for all of my cards in this video. Then I'm going to glue down that apple branch. Now you could do this card and not die cut that apple branch, it's just watercolor that background. I think that would look great as well. But by die cutting it, you get that white line around it, that white halo around it, that really I think makes it pop off of that background. Then I take one of the larger, more bold sentiments, glue that to the front of the card, and then I have the other sub-sentiment here. This one I'm going to glue on the inside of the card. Now for the ones I'm gluing on the inside of the card, I leave them white, but you could, if you wanted them to pop off the inside of the card a little bit more, you could easily ink blend them as well. Another option would be just to stamp them on the inside of the card if you didn't want them die cut. Again, I hadn't planned out exactly where every single sentiment was going to go, so if it was planned ahead of time, probably just easier to stamp and emboss it on the inside of the card. For my next card, I'm going to start my ink blending off similar to the last one, putting that blue where I want it to go behind my apple branch. But for this one, I'm going to also add in a little bit of the Magic Garden interference pad, filling in the white corner on the top right and the bottom left. And then I'm also going to do a little bit of that around the rest of the outside of the card, just to change it up just a little bit. This, because I'm doing the ink blending with the interference, is going to have that interference property to it. So when I tilt it into the light, it's going to have that blue shimmer to it. That's going to be really pretty with the tumbled glass ink blending on the center or the inside of the card as well. And because I'm using that same color for watercoloring the leaves from the apple branch, it's going to tie in with that as well. For the mat for this one, I wanted to use some gold, and you could use some gold specialty cardstock, but I have the Lisa Horton gold pad. This is just a quicker, easier, and in my opinion, more economical way to create a gold mat, and it looks fantastic. It ties in with that gold embossing. Another option would be to use VersaMark ink around the outside edges and use that gold embossing powder and emboss the edge, and that would coordinate really well with it as well. This has a little bit less dimension to it because you don't have the dimension from the embossing, but it still has that beautiful gold shimmer and it ties everything together really nicely. Glue all of that to the base of the card, and then we're ready to add the apple branch. And once we've added that apple branch, we can add our other sentiment to this card. So I have another bold sentiment here. I tend to favor the bottom left for these sentiments. I don't want the card to be top heavy, and when I kind of laid it on the top, it seemed like it would be, but obviously you can put it wherever you wanted. You could even just put these sentiments on the inside of the card if you didn't want to cover up anything from the front of the card. For this one, to change it up just a tiny little bit, I have that sub sentiment and I'm going to glue that to the front of the card as well. And again, if you think it's too crowded, you could always put it on the inside. I only did it this way to change it up just a little bit. but I just love those bold sentiments on there. I think they look fantastic. For my last card, I'm going to be using the apple frame layering stencil set. There are 5 different layers in this set to create that apple frame. So I'm going to be using a combination of distress inks as well as interference inks for doing that ink blending. Now you'll see ink on my stencil, and that is because this is the second time that I'm doing this apple frame. When I did it the first time, I was using the corners of the stencils to match up the different areas. And typically what I'll do when I do that is use some painter's tape on the top left corner and the bottom right corner. And then when I lay down each stencil, it automatically lines up. Well, Hero Art stencils have little holes in all 4 corners for registration marks. So if you have a larger piece of cardstock, you can use that to line them up. Because I'm not using a larger piece of cardstock, I typically don't use those holes, but I realized about the 3rd or 4th stencil in that the images weren't perfectly lining up. And then when I compared the stencils to them, those holes weren't in exactly the same spot when I lined up all the stencils together. So while those registration marks would make the image line up perfectly, they're not in line with the edge of the stencils for this particular set. I haven't really paid attention to other sets. I've never had this issue before. So rather than going by my little painter's tape way of lining up the stencils, I just lined up the images. The images are really quite easy to line up. There's only one little area on the bottom that doesn't line up perfectly, and it's not because the image wasn't lined up properly. The stencil was just like that. So for the leaves, I did the first layer with bundled sage distress ink, and then the detail layer for the leaves I did with the Magic Garden interference ink. For the branches, I used the Walnut stain distress ink, and I'm using some smaller brushes for these because there's smaller areas in those stencils. When it came to the leaves, I concentrated the darker color of the ink, or I started doing my ink blending towards the base of the leaves or where the leaves went behind an apple, and just kind of blended my way out in order to get that dark and light area to create some visual dimension. For the apples themselves, I'm doing the first layer with that sweet treat, so that's going to be nice and bright yellow. And then the second layer I'm going to do with one of the reds so that we have a combination of the 2 colors. I'm keeping this stencil here that I just did with that yellow to the side though, because I'm going to be using it again in a moment to add some dimension and shine to those apples. So for the second layer, I used the Golden Sun. So this one has that beautiful red color, but it has the gold interference to it. And I'm just doing the detailed parts of the apple. Now, because I wanted to have a little bit of color variation to it, I'm trying to make sure that there's some areas that are a little bit lighter, some areas that are a little bit darker, just to give it a little bit more of an interesting look. Now, when I go back to using the stencil that I used before that I have laying to the side, I'm going to add some transparent gloss texture paste, and that is going to add some dimension as well as gloss to those apples. So I'm going to line up that stencil where I had it before, and then I'm going to use the transparent gloss with a palette knife just to get a nice even coat on there. Because there's ink on my stencil, I am going to be picking up some of that ink with that transparent gloss. You can see it on what's left of my palette knife. So that is not going back into the container. We don't want to contaminate the rest of the gel that is in there. So it looks cloudy right now, but once it's dry, it dries completely clear and completely glossy. In between waiting for that to dry, I did completely clean off all of my stencils, including the ones that have the transparent gloss gel on that. You don't want to let that dry on your stencil. That's a great way to ruin your stencil. So I will typically go right away and clean all of that off just to make sure that nothing has a chance to dry on there. If you don't have the opportunity to do it right away, even putting it in a sink of water or a dish of water so that it stays wet will also help. To add just a little bit of color to the background here, I'm using a little bit of that Tumbled Glass Distress ink, concentrating some of the darker areas around the outside of the image and then going lighter towards the center. I just thought it looked a little bit nicer with the blue rather than that stark white. Could have done it on some light blue cardstock, but that would affect the color of the stenciled areas, especially that yellow. And by using it on white and then doing the ink blending afterwards, that yellow and red part for the apples is covered with that transparent gloss gel, so we're not getting any of that blue color contaminating or coloring or interfering with those colors there. For the mat around this, I used the same Hammermill Cardstock, trimmed to 4 inches by 5¼ inch, and then used that Golden Sun pad around those outside edges. For my sentiment, I have 2 different sentiments here that I'm using a combination of. I started my ink blending on the top with that Sweet Treat, and then started from the bottom using the Golden Sun, so they kind of blend together. I just thought it was a great way to incorporate the 2 colors of the apples into the sentiment. I'm going to put the sentiment right in the middle of that frame. I just figured that frame kind of looks like it needs something in the middle. Another option here would be one of those bold sentiments from the Your Golden Stampin' Cut set, but I've used them all with the other cards, so I didn't want to stop and emboss more sentiments, so I opted to do these smaller sentiments here. And I love the kind of ombre look between the 2 interference colors, and the gold embossing resists the interference ink, so we still see the beautiful sentiment in there. We just have the background of that card inked. So here is the finished card. I just love the look of that frame, and it's a perfect spot to just add whatever you want to the center. It would even be fun to use one of the stamped images behind there and just kind of incorporate the 2, but I'd like that on its own just with a sentiment. Then we have one of our apple branch cards with the red apples, and the video doesn't do justice to the shimmer. When you tilt this into the light, it has some gorgeous shimmer to it. A little bit more subtle on the watercolored areas, because anytime you're watercoloring, you're diluting those colors. So you're still going to have that shimmer, but it's going to be more subtle than when you're doing the ink blending with it. But still just a beautiful difference in finish than just the regular distress inks. And I just love using them for watercoloring or for ink blending to have that little bit of the shimmer on there. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.